Welcome to the first lecture in Module 4. And in this lecture, I'll provide a background on the Ruby programming language. And again, in this module, I'm going to give only a brief introduction to Ruby, enough to help you understand the Rails web application framework. So first of all, as you're well aware of by now, Rails is built on top of the Ruby programming language. And you'll see Ruby code in your model. We've already described this when we looked at the active record class. We're going to see it in the views, which we'll discuss shortly. And we'll also see it in the controller. So there's quite a bit of Ruby code that you see in this controller. So a brief history on Ruby. Ruby was created by Yakihiro Matsumoto, and people just refer to him as Mats online. Created in the mid-1990s, and his reason for creating it, here's a quote. I wanted to create a scripting language that was more powerful than Perl, more object-oriented than Python, and that's why I decided to design my own language. And so the focus, the central focus, and this is the thing you should keep in mind when you're trying to learn a programming language, is what's the model behind the language? And the model for him is that the focus is on the programmer. He wants to make the programmer as efficient as possible. This is a lot different than if you're familiar with, say, the C programming language. The C programming language is about making the ultimate code that's produced most efficient. And that's why you see things in the C programming language like the ability to create variables that live in registers on the CPU. That's why you have dynamic memory allocation and pointers. Those are all very closely tied to a particular machine model. So the model you should have in mind in Ruby is quite a bit different. Here's another quote. So again, the goal in this case is to maximize programmer efficiency. In other words, the productivity of the programmer. And nowadays, that's a lot more important. Programmers are very expensive, and machines and the speed of machines has gone up and up and up. So it's more important for a programmer to be efficient than for the program itself to be efficient. So here's another quote that I like. I hope to see Ruby help every programmer in the world to be productive and to enjoy programming and to be happy. That's the primary purpose of the Ruby language. This is, again, another quote from Mats. So, again, this is what you see on the web that's shortened, that Ruby is designed to make programmers happy. That's kind of a shortening of the previous statement. But this is the guiding philosophy, again, behind this. And one of the ways that was achieved was by designing the language around this principle of least astonishment. And this is a principle that's used in user interface design as well. When you click a particular button on in an application and it does something that you don't expect, you're astonished, and you don't like that in general. That's a bad thing for any application. And he applied that to the language itself. So here's what it means in his mind, that you want to that the language itself should behave in such a way that it minimizes the confusion of an experienced programmer. In other words, a programmer who's experienced with Ruby, if they execute a statement, they shouldn't be surprised by the result that's returned. Ruby is an object-oriented scripting language, and because of the design principle that was used here, many do find it intuitive, flexible, and extensive. Again, I'm not a huge proponent of any particular programming language. This is just the one that we need to use in order to better understand how to use Rails in order to build web applications. So this has kind of a low barrier to entry. It's very easy to get up and running in Rails, and so again, that's why I selected this language for this course. If you want more information about the Ruby programming language, here's a website that you can go to that's the official website for the language, but there are a huge number of tutorials online. So if you just do a search online for Ruby tutorials or Ruby references, you'll find plenty. And I'm going to reemphasize, I'm not going to give you enough information in these few short lectures on Ruby to really understand the language at a level that's going to make you an expert, but I'm going to give you some pointers that you can use to get a bit deeper. One more time, I'll say that the better you understand Ruby, the better you'll be able to use Rails. Now, we've already seen, and by now you already have Ruby installed and Rails installed on your system. Again, just to reiterate, if you type Ruby -- version, you'll see the version of Ruby. The package management system that comes with Ruby. The packages themselves are called gems, and to see which ones are installed on your system, you type gem list. And Once again, Rails is just a gem. It's just a Ruby package. And so in order to install it, you would say gem install Rails. This has already been done for you. Now, Ruby is an interpreted language. And this is different than, say, C or C++ or Java, which are compiled languages. And so let's discuss this. There's a number of different ways that you can execute Ruby code. One of them is to type what I show here, Ruby-E, which means it's going to execute whatever you provide in quotes on the same line. So here, this puts a string to the terminal. So if I say puts hello world in single quotes and the string itself is in double quotes, it will print out hello world and then returns me to the command line prompt. So this I'm just executing from my operating system prompt. So this -E again tells the interpreter to execute the line of Ruby code that follows. Now typically you'll take that code and you'll actually put it in a file, and the typical thing to use is the .rb extension. So if I take that code that puts hello world, remove the single quotes, and stick it in the file hello.rb and then type Ruby hello.rb, it'll execute that same line of code. So here I'm executing it by calling a file that contains Ruby code. And then finally, there's the interactive Ruby shell. This is an interpreter that allows you to execute Ruby code from a command line prompt, different from your operating system command line prompt. This is a prompt to the language itself. And some people call this a REPL, a repeat, execute, print, and then loop. So you're always looping over this code. I'll show you this in just a moment. So if you're using an interpreter, it's very easy to drop into that interpreter, test some code, and see if there's a problem. Inspect variables, do all of these types of things from an interpreter. So for interpreted languages, this is a typical way of doing debugging. This is not how you typically debug C, C++, Java code. Typically there's an integrated debugger as a part of the environment you're working with. And there are debuggers that you can get for Ruby as well, but in my experience, it's a lot easier just to open up this IRB shell and experiment with the code that you're trying to get to work and then observe the results through this REPL loop. Here's an example of how to do it. You type IRB, and you'll see that it tells you the version of Ruby you're using, and then it'll give you the line that you're on. And so if you put something like 2 + 2 in, it'll give you the answer with that arrow, which is 4, and now you're on the next line of code. So there's this REPL loop that we're talking about. Now, we've actually already seen this. We've seen this when we've done Rails console previously. Rails console is actually just IRB loaded with your Rails environment as well. So if you type Rails console, you're getting IRB, but it says that it's loading with the development environment as well. And so you've got the same REPL loop available to you, but you can inspect a Rails application this way. Again, this is the most common way that I use to debug Rails applications. So again, to reiterate, the entire Rails environment that you're working with is loaded when you type Rails console. This is how you can directly manipulate and interact with your Rails environment through the command line. And we've done this already by adding and deleting posts from the command line. And you've seen that in a previous lecture. And this is how I debug Rails applications. Most of the programmers that I work with as well, this is the quickest way to, if there's a problem, to get at it, is to drop into Rails console and to see if you can inspect the problem this way. So finally, let's talk about the language features that exist with Ruby. All modern programming languages that are being created nowadays are multi-paradigm. C++ was multi-paradigm, or is multi-paradigm, I should say. It has, both the imperative or procedure-oriented programming and also object-oriented. The .NET framework is the same thing that Microsoft has created. So Ruby is multi-paradigm as well. It's a scripting language, and that's maybe a little bit different than some of these other modern languages that I talked about. It's intended to be used to write scripts, and this is one of the reasons I believe it was selected for Rails. And scripts are just pieces of code that are typically used to automate execution of tasks within some other environment, typically at the operating system level. It's an imperative language, meaning it's procedure-oriented. So this is the traditional control structures that exist within it. It's an object-oriented language. In fact, it's a pure object-oriented language in the sense that everything in Ruby is an object. Everything inherits from this root object in the language called object. And finally, there are elements of functional programming that are built into Ruby. And Rails uses them, Ruby uses them extensively when you pass blocks of code into functions. And we're going to see this done quite a bit when we use iterators. This concludes the first lecture in Module 4.